Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our show. Today's deep dive is inspired by you, our amazing listeners. You guys suggest the topics, and we love diving deep to bring you those valuable insights. So let's jump right in.
Yeah, let's get started.
You asked us to explore the ideas of Steven Pressfield, and today we're taking a deep dive into his book, Turning Pro.
Oh, yeah, a great one.
Now, many of you are probably familiar with his earlier work, The War of Art, which really seemed to resonate with so many people who are wrestling with creative blocks. Writers, artists, entrepreneurs, anyone trying to bring something new into the world.
Absolutely.
Turning Pro kind of takes those ideas to the next level. But here's a fun fact. Pressfield actually published two other nonfiction books, The Warrior Ethos and Do the Work,
Oh, wow.
while he was letting the concepts for Turning Pro really simmer and take shape.
Interesting.
So what we're going to do in this deep dive is explore this really intriguing difference between living as what Pressfield calls an amateur versus truly becoming a professional. Now, this isn't just about, having a job title or, getting paid for something. It's really a way of being in the world. And he applies this not just to creative pursuits, but really to any area of life where you feel a strong pull, call it a deep desire to make a difference.
Right. I think that's what makes this book so relevant for so many people because we all have those areas, whether it's in our personal lives or our work or our relationships where we feel like we could be showing up more fully, more intentionally.
Exactly. And, one of the things that Pressfield does right off the bat is he presents this idea of the amateur versus the professional as his third model for understanding unhappiness.
His third model.
Yeah, so he contrasts it with two other ways that we typically try to explain why we're unhappy or unfulfilled.
Okay. I'm interested to hear this.
So the first one he calls the therapeutic model, and this is where we might say, oh, I'm, feeling this way because something's wrong with me,
Right. Right.
Maybe I had a difficult childhood or I have some kind of, psychological issue.
Yeah, like a clinical diagnosis or something.
Exactly. And the second one he calls the moralistic model. And this is where we think we've acted badly in some way, and that's the source of our unhappiness.
Okay, I get it. Like we feel guilty or ashamed of something we've done.
Exactly. But Pressfield says, no. The real issue, the real ailment is that we're living as amateurs and the solution is turning pro.
I love that. So it's not about fixing something that's broken. It's about stepping into a new way of being.
Exactly. And one of the things he emphasizes is that turning pro is free, but it's not easy.
Right. There's a distinction there.
Yeah, it's a decision, but it's a decision that requires a real change of mind. And often it means sacrificing comfort, letting go of old identities, and even sometimes, shifting the relationships in our lives.
It can be a real challenge to our sense of self.
Absolutely. And he actually uses the metaphor of pushing through a membrane. It can be painful, but it's necessary for growth.
So this is a really personal question, but when you think about the areas of your life where you really want to turn pro, what are those comfortable but maybe limiting things that you might need to reevaluate or even let go of?
Yeah, that's a powerful question.
Yeah, and it reminds me of this really interesting story that Pressfield shares in the book from his 20s when he was living in a halfway house.
Oh, yeah, he wasn't actually a resident there.
No, he wasn't, but he was drawn to the people there, and he felt this connection to their stories.
And he had this really vivid dream while he was there where his clothes were like neatly folding themselves and his boots were shining.
Wow, symbols of order and aspiration.
Exactly. But his reaction to this dream was so fascinating. It wasn't one of joy or excitement. It was guilt.
Guilt. That's interesting.
Yeah, and I think that really speaks to something that so many of us experience, this kind of underlying guilt around ambition. Like we're not allowed to want more or to dream bigger.
Right, like we should just be content with where we are.
And, in that halfway house environment, Pressfield talks about how the prevailing emotion, even though it wasn't often spoken about, was fear.
Fear.
Yeah, he links it to this primordial fear of annihilation, this sense of having hit rock bottom and feeling like there's nothing left.
That's a heavy thing to carry.
Absolutely. And he even says that he felt this fear himself, even though he didn't have the same history as the other people there.
So it was almost like a collective fear that permeated the entire space.
It's really fascinating. And so he decides to leave the halfway house, and he ends up in this incredibly basic cabin, no electricity, no running water.
Wow, a real departure.
Yeah, at the time he was driving trucks, so, his living situation was more about practicality. But looking back, it seems like that deliberate isolation, that stripping away of all the everyday comforts, was crucial for him to distance himself from that fear and move towards something more authentic.
It's like he needed that space to really confront himself, without any distractions.
Yeah, absolutely. And this experience leads directly into one of the core ideas that Pressfield introduces the concept of the shadow career.
Okay, the shadow career.
And his own prime example of this was his time driving tractor trailers in his late 20s and early 30s. He was fully invested in it.
Right, he was making a living doing it.
Exactly. But eventually he realized it was a way of running from his true calling, which was writing.
A sophisticated form of procrastination.
Yeah. He saw truck driving as superficially similar to writing.
Yeah.
It was solitary, it was masculine, but ultimately it didn't pose any real threat to his deepest fears about feeling as a writer.
Oh, that's interesting. So the shadow career is almost like a safe bet.
Exactly. And he presents this really intriguing question. What if you know your current job, your current life, is actually a metaphor for something else?
That's a powerful question.
What deeper ambition might it be masking what unfulfilled longing is lurking beneath the surface?
I love that because it really encourages us to look beyond the superficial and examine the deeper motivations driving our choices.
Exactly. And, Pressfield does acknowledge that this amateur life, which can often involve these shadow careers, isn't entirely without merit. He calls it our youth, our hero's journey, with all of its often painful but ultimately formative experiences.
Right, like the setbacks, the disappointments, those unexpected detours that ultimately shape who we become.
Exactly. It's almost like we need to experience those falls and get those scars to truly understand what we're reaching for.
Makes sense.
But he's careful to draw a distinction between this period of exploration and what he calls the shadow life.
Okay, so what's the difference?
The shadow life is characterized by this persistent state of denial and this kind of compulsive acting out.
Almost like an addiction.
Exactly. We become fixated on these false goals, driven by these urges that ultimately lead nowhere, and it keeps us trapped and unaware of our true potential.
And the longer we stay in this shadow life, the harder it becomes to find our way back.
He uses this really poignant example of a friend of his who was addicted to love.
Right.
And this person was incredibly gifted, a piano prodigy, a remarkably talented photographer, even a near world-class athlete.
Wow. So much potential.
But she was caught in this repetitive cycle of intense, but ultimately fleeting romantic relationships.
Like he's always chasing that next high.
And it seemed like this pursuit of the sublime through love, as he puts it, was a way to avoid the more demanding and vulnerable path of her true artistic gifts.
It's like she was using love as a substitute for her real calling.
Yeah. And what's really sad is that, she was aware of this pattern. They had even talked about it, but the habit was so deeply ingrained.
It'd become part of her identity.
And this brings us to the really crucial topic of habits. Pressfield states very clearly that the fundamental difference between someone living as an amateur and someone operating as a professional boils down to their habits.
Their habits?
Yeah, amateurs develop amateur habits while professionals cultivate professional ones.
It makes perfect sense.
And, the good news is that we humans are creatures of habit, but we also have the capacity to change those habits.
So it's not about some innate talent or lucky break. It's about the choices we make every day.
Exactly. And, he makes this really insightful observation that people who are caught in the grip of addiction are often incredibly interesting individuals. Their life stories can be filled with dramatic twists and turns.
Right. They've often lived a lot of life.
But the addiction itself is often excruciatingly dull because it's so repetitive and predictable.
That's like they're stuck in a loop.
Exactly. And he says that addiction can become a substitute for pursuing one's true calling.
How so?
Instead of facing the demanding work, the inherent risk of failure, and the vulnerability that comes with putting ourselves out there, we can get entangled in this cycle of addiction, which offers a kind of distorted drama without any genuine forward momentum.
It's like we're playing out our aspirations instead of actually living them.
Yeah, it's like staging a shadow symphony or a shadow drama of our lives.
I love that analogy.
The person who constantly talks about writing a novel but never actually puts pen to paper, or the individual with a never-ending stream of brilliant business ideas but never takes that first step.
We've all met those people.
And Pressfield points out that when you make that shift to turning pro-life actually becomes simpler in many ways.
Simpler.
Yeah, the constant drama and distractions of the amateur life tend to fall away. The focus narrows to the essential work.
It's like clearing out all the clutter to make space for what really matters.
Exactly. And he also suggests that our addictions are actually shadow forms of more noble callings.
Shadow forms?
Yeah, almost like encrypted messages from our unconscious self trying to get our attention.
That's fascinating.
He encourages us to really reflect on what our own shadow career or recurring addictive patterns might be trying to communicate to us.
What is he trying to tell us about our unmet needs or expressed desires?
Exactly. And then he shares this really poignant anecdote about his time picking apples with these migrant workers, Dave and Jack. Dave was a Marine veteran and Jack was this talented mechanic, but they had both consciously chosen this itinerant way of life.
Like they were drifting from place to place.
And Pressfield saw this as a form of pulling the pin, a way of deliberately avoiding commitment to a single defined path.
Avoiding commitment.
And he observed these two really significant characteristics of addiction reflected in their lives and in addiction more broadly.
Okay, what were they?
First, a sense of endless repetition without any real progress.
Like they were on a hamster wheel.
Exactly. And second, a subtle but significant payoff of incapacity.
Incapacity.
Despite their evident skills and potential, their chosen lifestyle seemed to lead to a kind of stagnation, preventing them from building more stable or ultimately more fulfilling lives.
Like they were capable of so much more, but something was holding them back.
And he really broadens our understanding of addiction beyond just substance abuse.
In what way?
He talks about things like an addiction to failure, an addiction to seeking sexual validation, an addiction to the pursuit of money, even an addiction to creating chaos or trouble.
So these more garden variety addictions can be just as damaging.
He argues that they absolutely can be.
Because they keep us from living fully and authentically.
Exactly. And, he contends that this force he calls resistance actively targets our ability to concentrate and engage in deep work.
Resistance is trying to sabotage us.
Yeah, it favors shallowness and endless distraction. That constant urge to check email or scroll through social media feeds anything to avoid that focused, meaningful engagement that our true calling demands.
And those distractions are so readily available.
It's really insidious, and he makes a crucial point that an addiction to external validation, the relentless pursuit of money, power, or fame, is another incredibly potent distraction from the real work.
The real internal work of discovering and embracing our own unique voice, our truth, our authentic self.
Absolutely. And, this really sets the stage for Pressfield's own pivotal year of turning pro when he was 31 in Northern California.
Okay, tell me about that.
He made this deliberate decision to strip his life down to the absolute essentials, focusing solely on his writing and consciously cutting out all those external distractions.
It's like a self-imposed exile.
It was a period of intense self-confrontation, facing those inner demons head on.
How did it go?
Well, even though that initial manuscript didn't find a publisher, that uninterrupted period of focused work was truly transformative for him.
So it was about the process more than the outcome.
Exactly. It was in that dedicated time committed solely to his craft that he truly transitioned into a professional mindset. And that shift stayed with him long after.
That's inspiring to hear.
And this leads us to a really significant concept, the idea of the epiphany.
Okay.
Pressfield starts by referencing this Gnostic belief, a spiritual perspective that emphasizes a fundamental sense of separation.
Separation from what?
From the divine, from each other, from our true selves.
Okay, that's right.
And they believe that exile is the essential condition of humankind.
So we're all in exile in a sense.
And he suggests that both the artist and the addict in their own ways are grappling with this deep-seated feeling of being somehow disconnected.
Interesting. So they're both trying to bridge that separation, but in different ways.
Exactly. And he explains that addicts often try to escape this underlying pain through transcendence, often through the use of substances.
Right, numbing themselves.
Or through anesthetization, like simply numbing themselves into oblivion.
Escaping reality.
But the artist, he says, seeks to reach what he calls the upper realm, not through escape, but through the dedicated labor and deep love of their craft.
So it's about confronting that pain and transforming it through creator expression.
Exactly. And he talks about the self-destructive habits and addictive patterns of the amateur as these self-inflicted wounds.
Self-inflicted wounds.
That offer a different kind of escape, the deceptive payoff of incapacity.
Interesting. So by sabotaging themselves, they avoid the real work of becoming who they're meant to be.
He actually compares it to those soldiers in World War I who would deliberately injure themselves to avoid the horrors of the front lines.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
And then he paints this really vivid picture of the amateur whose inner world is primarily defined by fear.
Fear.
Not just the obvious fear of failure, but also the often overlooked fear of success.
The fear of success.
Yeah, it's a real thing. And then there's the paralyzing fear of judgment by others.
Like, what will people think?
Exactly. And most fundamentally, the fear of being ostracized or excluded from their social group if they truly embrace their unique calling.
So they're afraid of being rejected by the tribe.
And he contrasts this with the professional who, while likely experiencing just as much fear, chooses to act in spite of that fear.
They don't let fear paralyze them.
And they don't allow their sense of self to be so tightly bound to their ego.
Right, the amateur's ego is often fragile,
Mhm.
constantly seeking external validation.
Exactly, which makes them so vulnerable to criticism.
It's like they're living for the approval of others.
And he also talks about how the amateur tends to fear solitude and silence.
Why is that?
Because those quiet moments allow the often uncomfortable inner voice of their true calling to surface.
The voice they're trying to ignore.
Exactly, and they try to avoid it through constant distraction and superficial engagement, often finding refuge in the endless stimulation of things like social media.
Anything to avoid facing themselves.
And the amateur is also often driven by a desire for immediate gratification,
That quick hit of satisfaction.
which ultimately proves empty, and they tend to lack self-compassion when they stumble, and often find themselves waiting for some external authority figure to grant them permission before they feel entitled to pursue their own desires.
Like they need someone else to tell them it's okay to go for it.
And their primary focus on the immediate product and the anticipated payoff makes them really susceptible to the empty promises of consumer culture.
Like they're always chasing that next shiny object.
And they also have a tendency to live mentally either in a romanticized past or a fantasized future.
Anything to avoid the present moment.
Exactly. All the planning and strategizing that always seems to start tomorrow is a classic hallmark of this amateur mindset.
It's like they're always preparing to live, but never actually living.
But Pressfield offers a different perspective on those experiences of exile and failure. He suggests they can actually be powerful catalysts, forcing us to finally act from our own core.
So failure can be a gift in a sense.
He believes it can be. And while self-awareness is that crucial first step for the amateur, the underlying fear of truly defining themselves often prevents them from taking any meaningful action.
It's scary to really own who you are.
It can be, and he has this really liberating realization that the tribe doesn't give a shit.
What does he mean by that?
He's saying that that imagined audience whose judgment we so deeply fear is actually comprised of individuals who are largely preoccupied with their own lives and their own struggles.
So we're not the center of the universe.
Not at all. And this understanding, while it might be initially jarring, can ultimately free us to pursue our own unique path without that burden of constant imagined scrutiny.
It's like taking off a heavy weight.
And he also makes this important point that it's entirely possible to be functioning as a professional in a shadow career while still operating as a complete amateur in your true calling.
Oh, I get it. Like the highly successful lawyer who secretly yearns to write a novel.
Exactly. They've mastered the game of their profession, but they're still playing small in the area that truly matters to them.
And that can be a source of deep dissatisfaction.
Absolutely. And the crucial moment of truly turning pro is when you finally heed that persistent inner voice, acknowledge that secret dream, and confront the very thing you've been most afraid of facing.
It's a moment of truth.
And, as he famously articulated in The War of Art and reinforces in Turning Pro, his life really does divide into two distinct phases: the time before he made that fundamental shift and the time after.
So it was a real turning point.
And it wasn't about some sudden enlightenment or transforming into a completely different person, but rather a fundamental change in how he chose to confront his fears.
It was about the way he showed up.
Exactly. And he talks about how when we commit to turning pro, our lives tend to simplify.
Simplify.
Yeah, because our focus shifts to intentionally structuring our days in a way that helps us systematically overcome those paralyzing fears and actively work towards our defined aims.
So it's about creating order and structure.
Our daily routines, our established priorities, almost everything undergoes a significant transformation.
It's a whole new way of life.
And turning pro also inevitably has an impact on our relationships.
How so?
Some of the old connections that were perhaps based on shared amateur tendencies may naturally fade away, while new, more supportive connections with fellow professionals or aspiring professionals often begin to form.
It's like our tribe changes.
Exactly, and it's a process that sometimes requires us to make difficult but ultimately necessary choices between the life we've known and the life we're actively building.
It can be painful, but ultimately liberating.
He draws this really compelling analogy between turning pro and overcoming an addiction.
Okay, I see the connection.
It requires a daily recommitment The professional understands that those same inner resistances will likely surface each day.
But now they have the tools to deal with them.
Exactly. They've developed the conscious will and the learned strategies to effectively navigate those temptations.
So it's about mastering the inner game.
Absolutely. And often the precise moment of turning pro is triggered by a significant, often deeply personal event, a kind of internal tipping point that you never truly forget.
A moment of transformation.
He shares some powerful examples. The profound realization Mrs. X had after a night of excessive drinking, and Roseanne Cash's vivid dream where she was dismissed as a mere dilettante.
Wow, those are powerful wake-up calls.
And then he shares his own really relatable turning point, which occurred after a period of hitting what felt like rock bottom in New York.
Okay.
And it wasn't some grand achievement or moment of profound insight, but the simple, almost mundane act of washing dishes after forcing himself to sit down and write, even poorly, brought him this surprising sense of being okay.
So it was the act of doing the work that mattered?
Exactly. It was the act of consistently showing up, not the initial quality of the output that marked his breakthrough.
It's about the discipline more than the inspiration.
And he talks about how these epiphanies, while they can feel intensely uncomfortable, even like a personal reckoning in the moment, ultimately offer us the immense power of facing reality with humility.
It's like we're stripped bare of our illusions.
And it's from that place of grounded awareness that the genuine will to change truly emerges.
That makes sense.
So what exactly are the defining characteristics of this professional mindset?
Yeah, let's break it down.
Pressfield provides a really comprehensive list of key habits and qualities.
Okay, hammer it
Okay, so professionals make a commitment to show up every single day. They stay focused on the task at hand, and they approach their work with a long-term perspective.
It's about consistency and dedication.
Exactly. And for them, the stakes involved are deeply personal and feel very real.
It's not just a game.
They cultivate patience, they actively seek order and structure in their work, and they demystify the creative or productive process, breaking it down into manageable steps.
They make it a practice.
Exactly. And they consistently act in the face of their fears. They take full responsibility and accept no excuses for not doing the work, and they learn to play it as it lays, adapting to circumstances as they arise.
They're flexible and resilient.
And thorough preparation becomes a non-negotiable aspect of their approach.
So they're not just winging it.
And importantly, professionals aren't driven by the need to show off or seek external validation.
They're not doing it for the likes.
They dedicate themselves to the ongoing mastery of their chosen techniques and skills.
They're always learning and growing.
And they recognize the value of seeking guidance and aren't afraid to ask for help when needed.
They're not afraid to be vulnerable.
And they also develop a healthy detachment from the immediate outcomes, not taking either failure or success too personally.
So they're not riding the emotional roller coaster.
They understand that they are not their instrument, but rather the one who plays it.
I love that analogy.
And they cultivate resilience and learn to endure adversity, understanding that setbacks are an inevitable part of the journey.
But they don't give up easily.
And ultimately, their professionalism is recognized and validated by other professionals in their field.
It's a form of peer recognition.
Exactly, through their consistent dedication and high standards.
So it's not about chasing awards or accolades.
And Pressfield also emphasizes this crucial element of courage.
Courage.
The willingness to confront those inner doubts and demons, often working in solitude, where amateurs seek the perceived safety of groups.
He has that great line, the amateur tweets, the pro works.
Yeah, and he shares this really powerful anecdote about Picasso, who was known to destroy his own paintings if they didn't meet his incredibly high standards.
Wow, that takes guts.
Illustrating that professional willingness to murder one's darlings.
In the pursuit of excellence.
And he also underscores the importance of cultivating a genuine love for the work itself, sharing a story about this incredibly effective horse trainer who made the training process feel like play for the animals and never pushed them to the point of exhaustion.
It's about finding joy in the process.
And the professional learns to focus intently on the present moment, actively banishing both fear and excessive hope as potential distractions.
Like Stephen Sondheim, completely immersed in the intricacies of his songwriting.
Exactly. And he strongly cautions against those seductive distractions of things like constantly checking email and that fleeting gratification of chasing those external marshmallows or superficial rewards.
The things that don't really matter in the long run.
The true professional acts in anticipation of the muse, understanding that consistent dedication and focused labor are what ultimately invite and reward inspiration.
So you have to show up for the muse to show up for you.
And the professional actively seeks wisdom and guidance from others,
Mentors and teachers.
but without ever surrendering their own autonomy or self-sovereignty.
They maintain their independence.
And they also avoid the trap of iconizing others.
Putting people on pedestals.
When they actively resist being placed on a pedestal themselves, understanding the potentially destructive nature of those dynamics.
Right. It's about staying humble and grounded.
They're willing to share their knowledge and insights with other committed individuals, but they recognize the futility of trying to mentor those who aren't truly willing to do the work.
You can't force someone to grow.
And, Pressfield really emphasizes that this professional mindset operates on these two interconnected levels.
Okay. Tell me more.
First, as this rigorous discipline designed to systematically overcome that persistent force of resistance.
Right. That inner voice that's always trying to hold us back.
And second, as this dedicated path towards accessing that elusive state of flow and even moments of genuine magic through the consistent application of order and that humble workmanlike practice.
It's like the ordinary practice opens the door to the extraordinary.
Exactly. And he introduces this really fascinating concept of the psychological salary that exists alongside any conventional financial reward.
The psychological salary.
Yeah, it encompasses that deep sense of pride in one's work, the intrinsic honor of the craft, and that profound feeling of belonging that comes from being part of a community of fellow professionals.
So it's about more than just money?
Absolutely. Even in the absence of significant external recognition or financial success.
It's about the intrinsic rewards of the work itself.
And Pressfield's own years of facing repeated setbacks and what felt like constant failure ultimately led him to this profound realization that he had no real choice but to write simply because he genuinely enjoyed the process.
So he found freedom in surrender.
Yeah, it transformed his writing from this desperate pursuit of success into a dedicated practice.
Okay.
And he defines having a practice as establishing this rigorous daily regimen aimed at both achieving mastery in one's field and fostering a connection to something larger than oneself.
It's about connecting to a higher purpose.
And a true practice often involves creating a dedicated and even sacred physical space for the work. He references books like Where Women Create that highlight the importance of environment.
Our surroundings can really influence our creativity.
It necessitates regularity, much like the disciplined routines of monks in a zendo.
That consistency is key.
It requires focused intention aligning with concepts like the 10,000-hour rule.
Putting in the time.
It involves confronting and overcoming those real inner obstacles, much like a sword master facing their opponent.
Mastering the inner game.
It demands dedicated effort without the distraction of ego and a constant understanding that even the most accomplished master remains a lifelong student.
There's always more to learn.
And ultimately, once one truly turns pro, there is no final destination. Life itself becomes the ongoing pursuit.
It's a journey, not a destination.
And he says that the specific details of what professionalism looks like in any given field become remarkably clear after that fundamental epiphany.
Like it all clicks into place.
Driven not by the allure of external rewards, but by a deep and abiding respect for the craft itself.
It's about honoring the work.
And he beautifully uses Patricia Ryan Madsen's What's in the Box improv exercise as this powerful metaphor for learning to trust that inherent creativity of the mystery and the reliable support of the muse to always provide what's needed.
Trusting the process.
And this leads to some really insightful axioms.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Like trusting your own creative instincts enough to write characters smarter than yourself.
That's a good one.
Having faith in the mystery to provide solutions even in those seemingly impossible situations.
Like Pressfield when he was writing that prison screenplay with no prior knowledge.
Learning to adapt and take what resistance unexpectedly offers.
Turning obstacles into opportunities.
And understanding that true mastery is a long-term endeavor.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
The professional understands the necessity of starting the work even before they feel fully ready, drawing this powerful parallel to athletes who play through pain and warriors who fight even when terrified.
Like the concept of sit chilly from Sue Sally Hale's horsemanship.
And he shares this fascinating story about the Maasai tribe and their tradition of moving their entire camp based on the intuition of the shaman.
Oh.
Offering it as this compelling metaphor for learning to trust those unseen forces and the wisdom of our own inner shaman.
That inner compass.
That deeply personal code of professionalism that guides our actions.
Like that.
And then he draws this fascinating connection to Rabbi Mordecai Finley's explanation of the Yetzer Hara, which in Kabbalistic tradition represents that inner shadow self and aligns remarkably with Pressfield's concept of resistance.
So it's a universal concept.
And he also talks about Musar as this tradition of ethical discipline aimed at overcoming the Yetzer Hara,
Overcoming our inner resistance.
drawing this clear parallel to the principles and practices of turning pro.
So it's about aligning our actions with our highest values.
And he concludes with this really powerful thought, emphasizing that the ultimate aim of turning pro, with all the inherent challenges and sacrifices involved, is ultimately for the benefit of the audience.
For the audience.
To refine our own pain, our own unique vision into a valuable gift that others genuinely need.
Like we're alchemizing our experiences into something meaningful.
And he reminds us, the listeners, that we are all, in our own way, that hero and that artist.
That's a beautiful thought.
So as we bring this deep dive into the transformative principles of turning pro to a close, we really encourage you to take some time to reflect on these concepts in the context of your own life.
Yeah, where are you playing small?
Consider those areas where you might currently be operating with an amateur mindset and what that pivotal moment of truly turning pro might look and feel like for you.
It's a question worth pondering.
Understanding this fundamental distinction can be such a powerful tool for navigating obstacles and pursuing your own unique callings with greater intention, courage, and ultimately fulfillment.
So this leads us to a final thought-provoking question for you to carry with you.
Okay, hit us with it.
What singular and invaluable treasure might the world be waiting for when you finally fully embrace your professional self and wholeheartedly offer your unique gifts?
That's something to really sit with.
Yeah, what's in your box?
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Turning Pro. We hope you found it valuable and inspiring.
Until next time, keep turning pro.
We'll see you soon.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.